I'm really in awe of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that has come together in the SaaS business. And just like an outsider who's sort of seen, companies evolve, I think SaaS companies built from India have much better fundamentals than B2C companies being built in India.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Startup Operator. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Jayadevan, who's an evangelist at Freshworks for startups. He's worked in the media for over 10 years now and even co-founded FactorDaily some years ago. We're going to be talking about storytelling, the media industry, startups, and a bunch of other interesting things. So without further ado, welcome Jayadevan to the Startup Operator podcast.
Thanks for having me, Roshan.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I've been cooped up inside the house, but I'm good otherwise.
I know you started fasting recently, so what's that been like?
I only managed to do it for 2 weeks. It's so basically intermittent fasting. So I've been on this whole fitness trip for the last 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So not 3 actually. I've been doing it seriously for the last 3 years, and the idea was to sort of get fit as we go along, take a very long-term view of fitness and
Right.
not set really, 3-month goals and 6-month goals, but, really start from the basics, build a good foundation, and then, sort of see where it takes you kind of thing. So it's a journey. So it's not like a destination that I was aiming at. So part of that is fitness. I thought, I tried a bunch of things like, I started running, I started weightlifting, I started doing a lot of things. And then I figured, hey, intermittent fasting, this is interesting. Let me try it out. So I did a little bit of research, and I'm new to it. But I won't say it was fun. It's difficult, and it's a very hard sort of a lifestyle to sustain. But I do see that there are some benefits to it. So which I'm yet to realize. So anyway, so it was a thing I wanted to try out. I think I'll be doing it more often, and just to see where it goes.
Nice. Yeah, I did read a post of yours some years ago. I recall that, right? About your fitness journey and so on. It's very interesting what you mentioned, right? Anything you do sort of consciously, over a period of time, you realize it's not a destination, but rather a journey, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. As I went along, I realized that, you can, people have already talked about this kind of a, mindset, which is called the growth mindset, and not like the whole, sort of, your mindset, which is a goal oriented mindset. So if you have a growth mindset, you're slowly adding things to your sort of, inventory of things that you do well. And over a period of time, you end up, when you look back, you end up seeing that you've grown quite a bit. So the returns actually come compound rather than sort of, you take one thing at a time and linearly finish it off kind of thing, right?
Yeah. No, you see these as sort of pit stops, I feel like. Even if you look at, fitness or whatever, it's great that you lost 5 kilos or, you're able to run 5 kilometers in under 30 minutes or whatever it is. Yeah. But I think this guy who's a Scott Adams has a great book on this. And he talks about systems, being greater than goals in some sense, right? Where you set yourself up for success rather than, treat this as like sort of milestones and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So Scott Adams has this really interesting theory about what's called the persuasion diet, right? So you don't actually diet, but you convince your mind, you educate yourself about what kind of food has more calories, what has less calories, and all of that. And you end up being, fitter and eating better and all of that. So rather than sort of, struggling too much with a lot of physical heavyweight stuff, it's easier to sort of get your mind in control and persuade yourself to become a better version of yourself.
Yeah. So let's talk about your current role at Freshworks. It sounds super interesting. So what do you do?
Okay, so I joke that I get paid to tweet, but obviously that's not what I do. So technically, the role is I'm an evangelist for Freshworks. The idea is to tell people what Freshworks does, the products that it offers, and all of that. See if I can use whatever right pieces on Freshworks. Talk about it on social media, go on sort of webinars and all of that. So that's there. But the team that I am part of is called Freshworks for Startups, and what we do is we give startups an easy way to access the Freshworks product suite, which is, we give them $10,000 of free credit. We give them access to mentorship, and sort of we onboard them into the Freshworks ecosystem and our people will help you and all of that to get to start using Freshworks products. And for a startup, it works because you get access to good product suite for free, at least for the time being. And then towards the end of it, for us, it works because, if the startup scales, they work really well. We also, they become our customers. And since we have a relationship, it becomes easier for us to sort of, carry that forward kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I do here. And I sort of help with a little bit of storytelling, a little bit of branding efforts, and a little bit of all of things. So
that's pretty interesting. So one thing I've noticed is that, and you've seen this as well from close quarters, right? I mean, the whole support ecosystem for startups has become so much better right now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you look at now versus maybe even 5 years ago, like there was practically not much of a startup ecosystem. You had VCs and you had some startups, and in between there was nothing. So now if you look at it, you have VCs themselves launching a bunch of initiatives like mentorship, webinars, podcasts, and incubators and accelerators and all of that. And these have become very focused efforts on the VC's part to improve their portfolios performance and all the ancillary stuff that comes with it. I think Axel has it, Sequoia has it, Bloom has it, pretty much all the good ones have it.
Right.
Now, just from a startup's point of view, there are so many of these support groups and companies which have already made it big, like for instance Freshworks, or all of us. They are also giving it back to the community in some way or the other. So you have like plans like hey, if you're a friend of Freshworks, kind of thing, and all of that. So there's a lot of ecosystem that is coming together. In Chennai, there is this whole strong SaaS ecosystem which is shaping up.
SaaS
in Bangalore, yeah, absolutely. So SaaS Boom is a really cool initiative. There is something called the Product Folks, which is happening out of Delhi. They're doing really good stuff on products. Axel has its own, Insights podcast. They have a sort of incubator of sorts and all of that. So there's a ton of support available, and I think it's really good how things have come together. And people are like, it's basically just a tweet away if you need help.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, something that I noticed as well, right? I mean, 10, 11 years back, I mean, a lot of the startup gyan was either, imported from the Valley, or, I mean, you heard it from someone who had read about it or something of that sort, right? But right now, you can get some solid, actionable insights from people who've actually done it here. I mean, I also feel that it's a reflection of the ecosystem kind of maturing, right?
Yeah, I like to see this as like maybe the second or third wave of the whole startup generation, right? Like in India, especially. So the first wave was maybe if you go all the way back, you had the Jungly and Naukri.com and all those guys. They did really well. Some of them did really well. Jungly got acquired by Amazon. Naukri went on and listed in the stock exchanges. Rediff and all of those. So those are the older generation. And obviously there was the other guys, the IT services guys, which is the Infosys, Wipro, and the TCS. They also did a great job of building global brands and bringing in a lot of revenue and all that, and especially incubating a lot of talent. Then you had this whole phase where companies like Flipkart started coming up. Like the thing here was, I think Flipkart was a game changer in the way that two people with like a middle class kind of background, coming in and doing something really big. And this was also the validation that venture capitalists really needed to be able to really believe in the whole India thesis. Because until then, I don't think people took India very seriously.
Yeah.
At least until the exit that Flipkart gave them. So I think Flipkart was another wave. What also got built along with Flipkart is a lot of good product leadership, a lot of good, engineering talent, a lot of, and a lot of money went downstream, not just from the VCs, but with the VCs, but you had like average employees with a decent amount of money and the appetite for risk, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just taking Flipkart as an example. There were many other companies, right? Like there was Redbus, which was a fairly Redbus was the probably the first decent VC exit, if you ask me in that sense.
Yeah.
100 million or sorts kind of thing, right?
I think 200 million. Sold to Naspers or something of that sort, right?
Yeah, Ibibo bought them. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And then, so Ibibo is part of Naspers. So you're right.
Sure.
Yeah. And then the other thing that happened was it was not just the VCs. At some point, folks like the Tiger Globals came in and they started cutting really big checks.
Yeah.
So VCs got like confident, and it also sent a whole signal to the real money people in the US and all that. And then you had a lot of money coming in, which is why Axel, Sequoia, and all of these funds had like $1 billion funds, or they quickly closed bigger rounds, and now you had a lot of capital to deploy, and you also have good talent, great product, people, all of that coming together. So the money was there, so risk capital was there. So essentially, we are at a really good place right now. And even if you look at what's happening right now with COVID, I think companies, especially the support ecosystem, has come together to help companies. So there are VCs who have launched funds. A lot of sort of debt funds to help startups tide over the crisis and all of that, right? So that is the whole India this thing. What though is a bit of a bummer is that the Indian consumer is still not someone who spends a lot, right? Like our per capita GDP is still very poor, and that results in the market itself being very small, which is where the silver lining is with companies like SaaS, which build from India but sell to the world, kind of thing.
Exactly what I was going to get at. I think if you remember those, decks of the 2013-14 era, when they said, internet penetration is whatever at this point of time, less than 25% or whatever, and, we're going to scale to this much, and, all of those modeling and stuff that they use to show market size. And then I think now we have come around to the consensus that there is probably around 60, 70 million people who are going to buy from e-commerce or whatever. And a subset of that will be like good paying customers, right? Repeated purchases and so on. So
exactly. So it's essentially the, what I think Harish Chawla really articulated really well in his article, right? On founding Fuel. He wrote about the whole India 1, India 2, and India 3 kind of concept, right? Like, and India 1 is really where, people have the ability to spend on e-commerce, where it makes sense for brands to advertise, spend big marketing dollars. India 2, India 3, and, further it's, I mean, I don't mean to be sort of, condescending or anything, but, it's really not, there's really no market for tech products out there. We are there. We have a lot more of fundamental problems to solve, like healthcare, sanitation, and education, and a bunch of other things like job, employment. We are sitting on top of a big employment crisis, right? Like, so all of that is where the focus needs to go. I mean, obviously, internet has played a big role in uplifting, a bunch of things, but I seriously doubt the ability for companies to make money off of that market.
No, I think the problems are a lot more fundamental. If you ask me, like the services have to evolve. Basically, I mean, the products and services that we're catering to these people, right? I mean, it really has to evolve. Sure, I mean, a person in a tier 2, tier 3 town who doesn't have access to, let's say, the latest fashion would love to get on, your e-commerce portal and order, right? I mean, but if you look at his or her daily behavior, there are so many fundamental gaps. Education is something that you mentioned, right? Access to good solid education, which is perhaps number one priority after healthcare for anyone, right, in India. I see huge potential, and also, I mean, I want to talk about the something that you briefly touched upon as well, which is the third wave, right? So if you look at pre.com era of Naukri and Sulekha and Rediff and all of them, and then if you look at Flipkart, post 2007 types. And then now if you look at the SaaS wave, right, that the both of us are, on, right? I'm super excited about this, and I feel like it'll be orders of magnitudes bigger than any of the previous ones that we've witnessed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really in awe of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that has come together in the SaaS business. And just like an outsider who's sort of seen, companies evolve, I think SaaS companies built from India have much better fundamentals than B2C companies being built in India. And fundamentals, when I say fundamentals, it's like about profitability and all of those things, and really solid entrepreneurs, right? And a proper business model, not that we'll acquire users today and then figure out making money some other day. Most SaaS companies that I know of are like, hey, we've got customers, how do we scale now? We've got money, like, and many of them even say no to money, right? Like, we don't need venture capital, we're just going to bootstrap it, kind of, right? So this is just like the really phenomenal. And sometimes I look at the
sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead. You should talk about the Waymo story as well, because I think you guys are also doing some amazing work there, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for that call out. But I mean, I was reminded about something that you spoke about, on your podcast. By the way, Jayadevan also runs a podcast called Use Case along with his friend Ravish. And you should definitely check it out. I mean, if you haven't, some really super episodes in there. I was listening to the one with Mona Gandhi, where she kind of mentioned, right? I mean, that when she returned to India, she realized that that growth meant optimizing budgets on Facebook and Google, and then figuring out what to do with the users that you've gotten through the front door later, right? So I was kind of reminded of that. And then if you look at SaaS right now, literally every SaaS founder is thinking, okay, for every dollar I spend, what is a multiple on that dollar that I'm generating, right? On a recurring basis as well. So
and the world of SaaS is a lot more scientific and data driven and all that, right? Like,
absolutely.
I see people talk about, what's my CAC to LTV and, what's all of that, right? And what's my sort of, all kinds of, good models that, and great business practices, right? So this is amazing. Like, and this is the culture, I think, that will lead to creating more sustainable companies. And not where, hey, I got 200 million users because I spent, $1 billion on marketing, right? Like, and now somebody else is spending that, so I don't need that. I don't have 100 million users anymore because it's not like I built a great product, right? Like,
so, when I kind of look back at some of the thinking of 5-6 years back or whatever, right? It blows my mind. I mean, what were people thinking? Because hey, I mean, if you give free stuff, people will like you, right? I mean, and if you give them a link often enough, if you put a link in front of their face, they're going to click on it at some point of time, right? So, but I mean, and then, you briefly spoke about Waymo, and it's been about 3 years with Waymo right now. And one of the things that really struck me when I started working for Waymo is how much of a focus there is on business fundamentals. I mean, we startup folks generally, have this whole credo of move fast, break things, whatever, try to reinvent everything under the sun. But one thing that really, really struck me, and I've seen this kind of thinking at few other startups as well, SaaS startups, is the focus on fundamentals, right? I mean, essentially, you're running a business and the business has to turn over a profit for every product or service sold. So yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Absolutely. And if you look at it, really, we're sitting on this whole multi-billion-dollar opportunity, right? With respect to the whole India to the world kind of model.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I was looking at the Bessemer Cloud Index the other day. So Bessemer Cloud Index, right? Like, people who don't know about it. So it's an index where Bessemer Venture Capital has put down like a list of cloud-based companies, right? Like, and all these companies have many of them are listed, and all these companies have a market cap of like upwards of 10 billion, $1 billion, and all that. Now, I feel like pretty much for all of these, there can be faster, better, more affordable alternatives being built out of countries like India. And I just don't mean like India per se, but I mean like there are so many destinations, right? Like, across the world, which can do this whole, building and this thing. So it doesn't have to be always, Silicon Valley kind of style of development.
Yeah. I mean, Harsh Gupta, who's a friend of mine, made this fantastic point, which is that, hey, I mean, if a company can move out of Silicon Valley, then technically they can move out of America as well, right? So, and now post-COVID, I mean, we're realizing, how much we overestimated the value and function of a workplace as such, right? As an office. So
I think there's still some merit in having an office, but it doesn't have to be like the whole, what you had earlier. Like,
absolutely,
so many meetings can just be calls. So much of travel can be avoided. So much of, that in-person brainstorming need not be in-person brainstorming. You can just think about it on your own time and then come back and do a meeting to arrive at some kind of consensus, right? So that's what COVID is sort of forcing on us, to learn new ways of working and getting better at it. And I think it's great for people who are remote, people who don't have physical access to Silicon Valley kind of culture and policies and all that. So that's amazing. If you look at the trend that we were talking about earlier, which is, the whole India to the world kind of thing, and it's really starting to show, right? Like if you look at Postman, which is, we just talked about Postman. Yeah, so they have like over 10 million developers on their platform, and they have like hundreds of thousands of businesses using them. They're making revenues. They just closed a round at a valuation of 2 billion. So this is like the fastest Indian company to get there, in such a short period of time. I think 6 years or something. The earlier one was Freshworks, which is $3.5 billion, 10 years. There is Dhruva, there is iCertis, there is a bunch of other guys who are actually showing that this is completely, viable to do business like this. And then there are several, multi-million dollar sort of businesses which are in the flanks, which are waiting to sort of, take over the world kind of sense. So this trend is just completely undeniable.
Yeah, no, the thing that blew my mind about Postman was not the $2 billion. Actually, it was the 10 million developers. I mean, just for perspective, right? I think how many users does GitHub have? GitHub has probably around 40 million users, right? And I think if I'm not wrong, I mean, it was founded about 10 years back, I think, right? Something of that sort. So for an Indian company to have 10 million developers for their services, just like phenomenal, like super phenomenal, I feel. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's just like a 250 employee company. It's not like the old generation, I have 100,000 people, right? Like, we're like it's like a small team, like, if you, in comparison, right? And if you look at the revenue per employee and the productivity and all that, that's like huge.
So let's talk about, I mean, we digressed quite a bit, and I'm fairly sure we're going to do this again and again, right? But let's talk about, your journey a little bit, right? So which is, you started by covering startups and then, starting a startup yourself and now working in a startup, right? So there are like multiple transitions in between. So what's that journey been like for you?
So this is interesting, even if I say so, because I consider that I've had a fairly different journey from several people that studied computer science engineering with me. So I went to college in Kerala in a small a college called the Government Engineering College, and I wasn't a purposeful student or anything, right? Like so I would do all kinds of things, right? Like, so no plan as such. Somehow graduate and all that. So I believe several of my colleagues were also of the same kind of breed. So we just had like a lot of fun. So out of college, I find myself that, hey, I don't have a job or anything, like I don't have a placement offer and stuff like that, but I always had a fairly decent outlook to life. So I took a bus and I came to Bangalore, and I went to the Manipal Center office, and I had 10 copies of my resume printed out, and I had no clue, right? Like, so I went to all the offices and I gave one sheet each to all of those offices. Those were like really small offices, like courier companies and all of those, and I didn't even know which company. So I was like, hey, here's my resume, give me a call types, right? So anyway, so but and I was living with my seniors who had like tech jobs and all that. So
right.
and then one day, I see an ad in the newspaper saying they needed reporters, and I said, hey, I've done a bunch of things, so why don't I try this? And then I went to the office, and I got the job at Indian Express. The only qualification I had was that I was blogging fairly regularly at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and I did, there were no internet. Internet was there, but in Indian Express office, you had like you had one computer and you had like 30 reporters where I joined, 30
Wow.
40 reporters, and only the chief of bureau had the computer, and we had to like if we have to do some research on the internet, we had to like queue up, right? So that's how it was. We had like the old switchboards and all that. And I'm not even talking about like 20 years ago or anything. It was just like 15 years ago, or 10 and 13 years ago types.
Right.
So I got the job. I started writing for the paper. I wrote about, did a little bit of crime reporting, did a little bit of and that's where I learned Kannada. And then I did a little bit of writing on city and civic issues. And then I moved to covering business, and this sort of changed my trajectory a little bit. I started enjoying writing about businesses, and I started writing about technology and IT companies. So at that time, it was all about Infosys, Wipro, TCS, all of these. And then you had this mid-sized companies, Mindtree, Hexaware, and all these guys, right? Like, so, and we were like, who's going to buy who, we've lost a big customer, and all these, really sort of financial stuff. And it was, in hindsight, it was super boring. But I was new, and I enjoyed doing whatever I was given as a task, right? Like, so then I moved to ET. Again, I was covering mid-sized IT companies, Mindtree and Hexaware and those kind of guys. There was one thing that all of us reporters used to compete for, which is to get to the front page of ET somehow, so to get to the front page, there was like two ways. One is you have like a big breaking story, or you write about something slightly offbeat, and then you time it in such a way that it's a lean news day, so your chances of getting into the front page is very high, kind of thing. So I would look for these offbeat stories, like startups, and some random person doing something very different, quirky stuff, right? Like and then I would look for I would time it as to publish it on send it to on Sunday, send it to the desk on Sunday, because on Sunday you have like very few people writing news stories. So that way I got onto the front page quite often, and this is also where my interest in startups began. And I was also sort of following
the kids who are listening to this will call it growth hacking, basically.
Yeah, I was just trying to survive, right? Like because at that time the ET newsroom was super competitive. Like you had really good people, right? Like people sitting to my left and right, and all of them, they were like breaking stories big time, like real estate, retail, human relations, conglomerates, market moving stuff and all that. And I was like trying to get like
Man, that was such a trip, actually. I mean, now that you mention it, right? I mean, if I think back at the stuff that made it to the pink papers that time, right? Like if Infosys lands a deal or something, I don't know, they land a G as a client or something, that would be like the 8 inch by 3 inch or whatever it is, big news, right?
Yep,
Man,
and leadership changes. Yep,
leadership. That was the other thing. Who moved to which other place?
And those days were fun, but it's very repetitive. Like if you listen to mature companies' financial press conferences and their earnings calls and all, quarter after quarter, they pretty much say the same thing every quarter, right? Like so you just lose a little bit of interest in it after a while. And then this is where my interest in startups started picking up. Like I started listening to reading the whole TechCrunch was being launched at that time, and I was a big fan of Mike Arrington and all that, right? Like, so I was reading all these pieces. I was like, why don't we have people like this in India, kind of thing, right? Like
right.
And so at that time TechCrunch was so interesting. They would just rip apart people, right? Like and all of that. So now I was at TT. I decided to sort of, so my boss Pankaj, he was the editor there for technology at that time, and he moved to Mint. So Mint was again this new paper which was launching, and they had Raju Narisetti, who had come from Washington Post, and they were kind of building a really stellar team.
Yeah.
And Pankaj had joined them, and I had an opportunity to sort of work with them. But ET and Mint have a non-compete, so I had to sit out for 6 months. So now I was kind of I was young and I was very sort of jittery, right? I just don't like sitting around kind of thing, right? So then I went to um, yeah, so at that time while I was sitting around, I went and met a lot of people, and I met this guy called Ashish Sinha, right? Like so for people, I mean, a lot of us know Ashish, so
From the
Ashish used to
plug
run.
base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So plug.in, right? Like,
Yeah.
so Ashish was interesting in the sense, yeah, Ashish had a very keen sense of product and stuff like that. So, and he was a product manager at Yahoo, and he had left the job, and, he had started this plug.in portal where he would cover startups and, products and stuff. And it was around the same time Your Story was also launched. So the difference here was, Ashish would actually look at the product and talk about it. And I know like a lot of people don't like him or all that, but uh, I found that a great opportunity to learn more about startups. And I told Mint and Pankaj that I won't be joining. I want to do this job at next big what. So I was there, I think, first editor of sorts. And Ashish and I, we hired a bunch of people, like 4 or 5 small team, and we grew it. We did well for a while, and uh, we used to break a lot of stories. And but one thing that stayed with me from that journey is that I built a lot of relationships. Like I met hundreds of founders, I wrote about them. And then I also took away the fact that as journalists we never used to care for the products or the companies that we wrote about. So one thing that Ashish would say is you have to try the product if you're writing about a startup,
Right.
because only then you will be empathized, or you'll see the true potential of it or the lack of it, kind of thing. So I took that away. I went back to ET, where Pankaj was again joining back at ET. We launched ettech.com. Sorry, long spiel. I think this is getting a little boring, but
No. I mean, this is pretty interesting because I mean, I also want to talk about how media itself has evolved right in this time, and we're getting to understand a bit about it as you're talking about your journey.
Sure. So then I went back to ET. We launched ettech.com. I had the opportunity to hire more people, and it was a small team. It had a lot of support from the company, and it did well. This is when I was also start itching to do my own thing. Like both Pankaj and I were getting restless, seeing all the startup activity happening around us, and we were like, hey, what's happening? Like, the other thing that drove us to startup is also that we were seeing a lot of changes that was happening to the society because of the new age technology companies.
Help us
And
understand that a little bit more.
yeah, so there was Flipkart, which was talking about behavioral changes. There was Ola, which had come in. There were a lot of these other companies. There were Reliance was talking about launching Geo. Google was talking about hundreds of millions of connected users. Facebook had come in. So we actually wanted to come out of a newspaper kind of environment and help our readers really understand the impact that technology was having on the people. So which was pretty much like tech/society/culture kind of a beat. Now, in a classic newspaper situation, it's difficult to get real estate for that, because newspaper readers don't come there to read uh, the about the societal issues of tech, or ethics and all of those kind of things, right? So, and also deep tech, like Bitcoin, blockchains, these things were coming up. SaaS was coming up. So how do we? So we wanted to really cover these things in depth, and that's why we said, hey, we need to free ourselves from the whole print mindset and go into a
And one of
different kind of
the so and just to touch upon what you're saying, right? And one of the best things that to have happened, and FactorDaily was a pioneer in that, was this whole long form writing, right? Because as you correctly mentioned earlier, I don't know if it was the limitation of space, or I mean, if things were, that's how it was structured. all you would read is funding news, right? So and so raised this amount of funding, and or something of that sort. And it used to just annoy me because beyond a point, I mean, you tune out, right? And but I mean, you guys, I mean, even if I think of something like the Premji story that I think Pankaj wrote, right? There was so much depth in that. I mean, and as we spoke about earlier, Wipro and Infosys were regularly in the news earlier. But truly, I mean, I only got to know the person as such on that article, right? And that was a phenomenal article, amazing, one of the best that I've read in the last 10 years, I think.
Yeah. So we just said ki, like the real estate and the mindset itself was not conducive to do justice to what was actually happening on the ground, and that's where the FactorDaily sort of happened. And we did stories about early days of Bitcoin, and we did stories about people who got defrauded with Bitcoin. And the difference here is that look, when you do a funding story, at least about 80-90% of the times you get the story after everything is done. So there is really not much you are contributing, or this people can read it just for it's an FYI, everything is done, hey, here's the story, right? Now what we wanted to cover is get in ahead of the curve, right? Like and tell people what's coming around the corner, or what's after, when you climb the mountain, what you see, kind of thing, right? So we were like, hey, Bitcoin's coming, how can it impact people? What are the chances that you will get defrauded? And we did some really good stuff, especially with AI, with Bitcoins and all that. So we won journalism, at least I like to think that way, but we lost the business model question, right? Like, which is a lot of hindsight sort of learning. What we realized was that
sorry, go ahead, please. I had a point to add, but go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
No, I really feel that Substack right now should have been there in 2015-16 for you guys to really kill it, I feel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, because in those days, I mean, it's not like a long time ago. It's
5 years, 5-6 years.
Yeah, it's just like 5-6 years ago. And the challenge was, if you want to build a payment sort of gateway, it will take you some time and a lot of development resources and all of that, right? The entire infrastructure of, getting paid for what you write, or the digital ecosystem was not as mature as it was now. But now you have like products like Substack, and I hear that Scroll guys are coming out with a new product for, payments, and so recurring payments are getting better. People like Ken have shown that the subscription model really works. The new publications like the Morning Context and all of these guys, right? So I think so we had a slightly different take at that point about subscription itself, and that was key. Because our stories were in public interest, should we if we put it behind a paywall, then will it actually have the reach and the impact that it should have? Now while our journalism was expensive, funding it was very tricky question. So we kind of we grappled with those kind of issues a lot, and which is where I said, like, business model was always a challenge for us.
Right. And how do you see journalists itself change during the transition? I mean, so one of the things that that you, again, I mean, I think you touched upon this earlier as well, being ahead of the curve, right? I mean, over the last 3 years, whenever I've interacted with journalists as well, and I don't know if this is specific to certain journalists, or if that's a fundamental mindset or whatever, right? They would always ask me about, when are you guys raising funds? And these are not even journalists per se. I mean, I get it that certain section of the media has to cover this part, right? I mean, funding, M&A, so on and so forth. But I mean, and you were one of the few people who really got down to depth on in terms of understanding what we did, right? And I spoke to you about Waymo that time. I still remember. And it was an hour-long conversation that I had with you, right? Walking you through customers and product and so on and so forth, right? Why do you think that people why do you think that media folks are not so keen on getting down to the depth of certain things? Is it just a time challenge, constraint? What is it?
So I think there are a lot of things that are at play here. Like, back in the day, and this is maybe even just about like maybe 7, 8 years ago, you had some of the really smart people in the newsroom. And this is not a commentary on the intellect of the people who are working in journalism or newsrooms today. I don't know, but in those days you had very smart people. Like, I had colleagues who had studied at London School of Economics and all these really big places, and they still chose to become journalists because they believed in certain things, and they wanted to see themselves doing some kind of meaningful work, right? Like, but what happened in the transition where the media went through the whole business model crisis is that these people were not being compensated or rewarded, right? Like, and it's not just about money, it's about seeing some really good stories out there in the public. Now, not just seeing the story in the public, but also having the you know good feeling of, I did a story and it had an impact, right? Like, so nowadays there is very little impact that is happening because people have become desensitized to corruption, scams, and all of these things. And there is no uproar in the parliament because a few hundred crores were siphoned off from the exchequer's pockets, right? Like, so nothing is happening, so people are wondering, why am I even doing this kind of thing? So a lot of these smart people left. Now, in the absence of those really smart people and mentors and all of that, what you get is a very unisided, single-sided view of, hey, okay, let's have funding because it's an easy thing to write
It's
about.
like the
Because other
lowest level of abstraction that you can find, right? That's the newsiest news you can find, really.
Exactly, and you can't go wrong with it because most of the times companies will tell you when they have raised funds. And you can't have, and it's also you can't go with many of those businesses because wrong with many of those businesses because it's already been validated by the investors and blah 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 kind of thing, right? But if you were to think about it like someone who actually cares about the beats that they cover or the things that they write about, they would actually go down. And that's the kind of writing that gets the respect of the people who read it. The challenge is not enough of that is being done, but not enough of that is also being consumed, right? Like, I think a little bit of fault lies on the part of the audience as
No,
well, because
absolutely. I think you get the kind of stuff that you consume, right? I mean, you get you get the kind of stuff that you deserve, basically, right? So if you're going to like fall for clickbaity journalism, then you get more of clickbaity journalism. Okay, I mean, that's what people are going to optimize for at the end of the day. So, I mean, for 3 years I've been talking about SaaS story, right? I mean, like this whole amazing SaaS wave that we're on, and it's going to take off. It's going to take off. It's going to take off, and finally, I mean, people are sort of seeing that, but then it was so crystal clear even 3-4 years back, right? I mean, I guess, I guess things will evolve, and I am very, very optimistic actually about media sort of unbundling and becoming a Substack, Substacks sort of a model, right? I mean, multiple people running different Substacks and so on and so forth. The other type of journalism, right? I mean, is that whole gotcha journalism, right? So we've seen this with what happened with Balaji Srinivasan, and I think that was Recode, right, in the US, which is just like pointless, right? I mean, which is like totally missing the forest for the trees. Not really. I mean, it's just become gossip journalism, actually, really, about tech, right? I mean, yeah. So
look, so many times what happens is, if someone's new and very desperate for a story, and by mistake somebody slipped up and said something interesting, they'd go back to the newsroom and tell it to their seniors, and the seniors or the editors will be like, wow, what a story, like I need this on page 1 tomorrow. And you just don't have a choice, right? Like, so, and I would say, I've also been part of that sort of, and I've also made those mistakes. But what I've realized over time is the story you got by publishing that particular piece is much smaller than the story you could have had down the line if you had sort of nurtured that relationship and built trust.
exactly.
So you would have like really big scoops down the line if you hadn't burned that source, or if you hadn't shown that you're just an eager reporter to get to do gotcha, right? Like, you said something and I have it on record now, right? So you can't say I didn't say it, right? So,
yeah.
So that's the thing. The other thing is, television still does a lot of gotcha journalism,
Yeah.
and it's frankly, it's a circus, right? Like, so
it's crazy. I just actively avoid the news. I mean, so one of the things that's happened almost organically is that I've lived without a TV now for about 10 years, I think. And, my life has completely transformed without the TV, right? So, which is that I don't have something blaring in the background right now. And I feel Twitter sometimes can become that. So, I mean, I prune everything, like assiduously prune everything on my timeline. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that I highly recommend as well.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like, just like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation about fitness, you don't want to eat all the junk food and, all of that. You really want to consume, the news that matters most to you. And you have to be very particular about it, because this is not something that will immediately make you fat or bloated. But, it is making you an idiot, right? Like, because when you consume this, a whole lot of junk news, you have people who are not consuming that but are very careful about what they're consuming. They're clearly leaping ahead of you in terms of the intellect that they're building.
If you kind of look at it from an evolutionary perspective, right? I mean, you don't even have to go back like tens of thousands of years. I mean, you just look at it 20 years back or 30 years back, right? The amount of news or whatever it was that you knew versus what you know today in one single day, right? It's just insane. And there's no way, I mean, our brains have evolved, our bodies have evolved to consume all of that and be passive to 99.99% of that, and then only react or only process that 0.0001% that's actually useful to you, right? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of insane. So
totally.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was also storytelling, right? Which is something that I feel like, as journalists, one of the key traits for any journalist and any content person is to be an extremely good storyteller, right? To look at data, to look at to add perspective to data, to add that element of I don't want to say charm. I want to say, like, present it in a way that's consumable, but also really makes sense, right? What are the elements of good storytelling? So how do you go about crafting a story?
So it really depends on, what kind of story, who's the audience, and bunch of other things. But there are some fundamentals, right? Like, the first thing is to understand what is a story. So I would say a story is something that is not above or below normal, right? Like in journalism, we are taught this, like, if a dog bites a man, it's not a story, but if a man bites a dog, it's a story, right? So it's an easy way to remember what exactly is a story. So for example, today, if you say, hey, I come from a middle class family and I've given up my plush job to start a startup, it's not really a compelling story. But 5 years ago, that was a compelling story because that was new. Nobody had done it. And the normal thing was, if you were from a middle class family, you went to IIT and then you went to Google or Facebook, or you went to the US to do some studies, right? That was a normal story. So in that kind of, when the normal is that you have people who took extraordinary risks and started up, that's a story at that point in time. That's not a story anymore because it's starting up is mainstream and people are doing it all the time. So you need to look for a different story. Now there can be many elements to this. So one easy way to come up with a story is to go and look at yourself and see if you have instances in your life that are worth talking about. While you were being raised, while you studied, while you sort of worked at your first job, second job, in your environment, do you have instances? Like, I like the story about Red Bus, right? Like, so guy goes to the bus stop to find that it's very hard to buy tickets, and he solves that problem.
Or the eBay story,
Now
right?
The eBay story. So there are several of these stories, which kind of I put them in the whole personal kind of a bucket, where you are scratching an itch, and then you're telling that story, and there will be several others who have scratched the same, who wanted to scratch the itch, or had faced the same problem. So the story resonates with them, and it takes off. Now it's important not just to be, a storyteller if you're just a founder. You have to be a good storyteller if you're an employee, if you're a product manager, if you're, an HR person and all of that, right? Like, you have to align teams. For that, you have to have a great story. You have to have the ability to communicate effectively and with clarity and things like that. So if I'm a product manager, I want to talk to engineers, I want to talk to, designers, and I want to talk to, all kinds of customers and all of these people, right? So how do I tell, a compelling story and drive them to sort of deliver on a mission, right? Like, so often engineers won't report to you, so you have to get them excited nonetheless, right? Like, so how do you do that? So storytelling is core to the success of any role that you do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, whether it's product, whether it's marketing, whether anything, right? I mean, really, storytelling is at the core of it, I feel, because you're really getting an audience to understand what the hell you do, basically. So, yeah.
Exactly. So numbers and charts and all those things may not stick to sort of, people, but if you have a great story, people will remember that.
So now we are seeing a lot of journalists and so on, right? I mean, transitioning to actually working in a startup or a company or whatever, right? I mean, because obviously there's a huge amount of churn that's happening worldwide, not just in India, right? What are the challenges that you perceive while working in startups, right? I mean, and what are the opportunities to grow?
So I can actually tell this from 2 points of view. One is having been a startup founder myself, and two is now working for a slightly larger, more mature kind of startup, right? So the early journey is very difficult, not just for journalists going into that role, but for anybody, because the like if you take the FactorDaily example, right? Like in the early days, we made a lot of changes, and we made changes quite often, and that was deliberate. That was not because we were fumbling around, right? Like, we would try a few things, it doesn't work now, and we would chase it down to, like, the ground and see, okay, this really doesn't work, as things stand today, we need to change. So typically you would call it a pivot, or a change in direction and all that. Now if you're an early employee or you're a journalist kind of thing, you've been saying a certain set of things to all the stakeholders that you know of, like you're cultivating media relations, you're talking about a certain story and all that, and it doesn't work anymore. Suddenly you have to go back to the drawing board and start again, kind of thing. That can lead to a lot of frustration, right? Like, hey, how can you, kind of thing. But the reality is, if the founders don't take that call, the chances of you succeeding are even worse, right? Like, so when you're doing that thing, you have to be super flexible, and you have to be super perceptive. So, and you have to be very careful about what you communicate to the outside world, especially in the early days when the product is still not mature, or you don't have some kind of a compelling story or product market fit and all that.
So you
Now,
sort of
for
have
a
to
company
control the narrative, I feel.
Absolutely. So you can have the urge to say everything to everybody, but it just has to be very controlled as to what you tell or present about yourself to the outside world. Now, from from being a journalist, having come into a company like Freshworks, I think there are different types of companies, and you need to pick which you will be comfortable with. So, for example, as a journalist, you're sort of uh, your level of access is insane, right? Like, you will get access to CEOs of very different companies, you will get access to all big guns, right? All you have to say is, hey, I'm from the so and so kind of thing, and people will oblige. You are allowed to be a fool most of the times. You are allowed to have not know so many things, right? Like, because they'll say, okay, he's a journalist kind of thing. So and the difference is, when you move into a corporate, your playground or your canvas is actually much smaller, and your level of access might come down quite a bit. So, and you can see this as a challenge or an opportunity, and you have to work within a certain sort of framework, right? Like, there are people who are good at their jobs and trying their best, and so all those challenges exist of being working in a classic company. But that's also exciting in the sense that companies like Freshworks are a lot more free in terms and new age in terms of storytelling. So Girish himself is a great storyteller. He encourages people to write more often, create content, talk about things, if you're doing something interesting in product, all that. So I found Freshworks as a really nice sort of landing pad for myself. And we did I got some really good opportunities, like for example, to drive the whole project around Indian democratic design, and and now I'm working with so I think it depends on really where you land. There is no one size fits all kind of rule. There are companies which are very sort of boring in that sense. So if you are comfortable with that, that's fine. It's your call kind of thing. I would say really understand what the company is about. See how much of sort of leeway do you have to actually do storytelling. So again, Freshworks, what I like about Freshworks is beyond the job, I get to do a lot of other things, right? Like, which is aligned to what the job, but it's kind of not exactly my mandate at Freshworks. So many companies don't allow you to do that. And that can become a sort of morale killer for most people. Like, people who are used to doing many different things cannot suddenly be told to say, okay, here's a box and this is where you need to be, kind of thing.
So
I think modern companies are changing. Most of the new age companies are that way. So you can't say, hey, what, you can't be an Instagram blogger while you're working at it, because you're making money off of it and it's on the company's time. We're not on the whole timesheet kind of model anymore.
No, I mean, I think, classical avenues for journalists within companies, PR or content or whatever, right? But as you mentioned, I think a much wider role can exist as well, only if you choose to look at the canvas as sort of an opportunity rather than, be overwhelmed by it, or like be frustrated by it and say that, hey, nothing is structured and I want to do this one thing, and why am I saddled with all of these other things to deal with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly believe that you have to reinvent yourself at some point or the other. I know this sounds like a little bit of gyan, but the thing is, it's really helped me, right? Like I was doing computer science, and then I went to become a journalist, and then even within journalism, I made so many changes to the way I look at things, and now I'm like actually getting much closer to like real businesses, right? Like so, and there's so much to learn from all your colleagues, and I feel like you can bring together a lot of unique sort of learnings and skill sets that can make you unique and well positioned in the market if you're out there for jobs, or if you're going to start up at some point and all that.
Okay, let's move into a rapid fire round. It's one of those things that you have to do in interviews nowadays, right?
I don't like this round, so
okay, don't worry, nothing scandalous as such. Just short, interesting answers to a bunch of questions, right? So beginning with the best story that you've read. That should be a handful, I know.
I like this piece, which is called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. And this is a bit of a reference piece for most writers and journalists. It's about how, the writer was tasked with writing about Frank Sinatra, who's not very easy to access, and he's like a big deal in the US, right? At that point in time, he's an amazing singer and all that. Now he has no access, and he ends up writing this really long, beautiful piece without having actually, accessed Frank Sinatra, but just watching him and they're putting things together. So I thought that was a great piece of journalism.
Right.
I like the work of Hunter Thompson, who's kind of Hunter Thompson, and people like Tom Wolfe and all that. So that's a genre of writing called gonzo journalism, or all of that, right? So where you also put yourself in the middle of the story as one of the characters.
I think there was a movie on him, right? Johnny Depp movie, I think, on Hunter.
Yeah. So there is. Yeah, so there was this movie called Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Correct.
Yeah, there's another one called Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved. So that's something I like. Same, I think that's also Hunter Thompson.
Right.
I like, so those are some of the stories. From a corporate storytelling point of view, business journalism point of view, I like the book called Too Big to Fail. It's by Andrew Ross Sorkin, and it's a beautiful blow-by-blow account of the whole 2008 financial crisis that unfolded. Right, and that's a really good book. If you watch Margin Call, so this book is like maybe about. It's got the same tension and same beautiful writing and all that, right? Like as a well-made series. Yeah. So I like that. So there's a lot of stuff. Sorry, it ended up being not so rapid. So.
No, I understand. And Margin Call was a great movie actually. Actually, a bunch of movies around the 2008 crisis. I like Big Short, which is a fantastic movie as well. So So your favorite journalist?
My favorite journalist. Tough question.
Barring Pankaj. So I'm going to eliminate Pankaj from the list.
Honestly, I like what and I don't know if I can pick out individuals, but I like some stories in the morning context. I like some stories in the Ken. If you're looking at it from an Indian point of view, I like some stories which come in ET. So it's difficult to call out a certain journalist kind of thing. I think
someone you admire, basically.
Okay, this is a difficult question. I mean, see, look, I like I like my earlier editor Josie.
Right.
So for being an editor with a lot of spine, right? Like now, which means once you have cleared the story, you will stand by it, and so which means you have a high bar of clearing a story. You make sure the story is watertight and all that, but once you've cleared it, you stand by it, kind of thing. And this is from a lot of personal experience of and that's when I realized the value that an editor can bring into a good story kind of, or a good journalism kind of outfit. So I would say Josie is clearly up there.
Okay. Your favorite founder/founders? Again, we'll eliminate Girish from the list, obviously.
My current favorite is the folks at Postman. Again, just because of all the stories that we were talking about. And not just because they're successful, but because of I think they're very deliberate about the way they've gone about doing things.
And quietly as well, right? So phenomenal.
Yeah.
So okay, the weirdest thing a PR person has pitched you.
I if I open my inbox, I'll see like some really random stuff. I mean, people will pitch you for like crazy stuff, and I won't blame them again. Blame them for it. It's their job.
Right.
Like I've been pitched to write about maybe, I mean, I everybody knows. I mean, pretty much I like to think that way. That pretty much everyone knows that I cover and write about technology, right? Like, so I've been pitched to write about like really random stuff, like ranging from soap to FMCG goods to underwear, to all of that, right? Like, so
right.
You get pitched a lot. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So one thing that marketers can learn from journalists.
Clear and direct communication.
Okay. One thing journalists can learn from marketers.
How to sell your story.
Yeah. And if you had to do something differently, what would that be?
Something differently in terms of
pick anything.
When I was, if I was to start up again, I would hire people very carefully. Like I'd like be really, really careful about who I hire.
Yeah. I mean, hiring is one of those things where I feel like you have to be, I mean, you cannot be optimistic about hiring, and naturally, I mean, I like to see the good in everyone. So I have this, huge problem where, so that becomes a huge problem with hiring. Hiring is something where if you're not even like a little bit unsure, I mean, if you're even a little bit unsure about someone, you should. I've never seen it work out actually. In the 12, 13 years that I've hired, I've never seen it work out really. So yeah.
The thing is, the thing is, like, it's nice to sort of be a person who instinctively trusts other people, and we all default to being a trusting kind of a person. But we have to realize that, especially in an Indian context, we are all growing up to ace tests, right? Like, so we mugged up things right from our childhood to, even all the way up to IIT and masters and all that, right? Like even PhDs are, sort of, people are doing crazy stuff with that. So when you're hiring, a lot of people will come to you with that mentality saying, I'm taking a test and I've sort of, I've done pretty much all the preparation, and it's very hard to spot, who is good and who is bad, because in that kind of a situation, everybody is prepped really well.
That's that's just like one of those really, really dangerous things, right? When someone is so prepped. I mean, that's another bullshit detector that I have. When someone gives you exactly the answers you want to hear, that's when you realize, I mean, there's something wrong here.
Yeah, absolutely. And in early days when you're hiring, you can't be too picky as well. So that's a very tough balance.
It's hard. So it's definitely hard. Okay. The best lockdown/quarantine hack.
Best quarantine hack. I would say running.
Okay.
Because it kind of keeps you active and sort of on top of your game.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's something that I've been meaning to do, but I haven't got around to it. I'm not a huge fan of running, but considering that, we're all literally like, being forced to be indoors, I think I might like running more than I would have, I think, earlier. So cool. We'll try that out.
Yeah, totally.
What book are you reading and what would you recommend?
Reading a book by Rajmohan Gandhi on the history of southern states. I've just finished some 40 pages and it's interesting. It talks about the 15th, 16th, 17th century India and, how different fiefdoms evolved and things like that. It's,
Nice. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So from a recommendation point of view, I have a pretty much standard list. I would, especially if you're, into writing and things like that, I would just recommend this book by William Zenser called On Writing. And I would recommend this book called The Elements of Eloquence. Both are great books for people who want to practice writing.
Okay, I'm noting that down actually. In fact, I mean, I got a book by Neelkanta Shastri on history of South India. A friend of mine recommended this.
So that goes even further behind, and that's a classic. That's one of those original works kind of thing. I started on it a few years ago, but I just couldn't get through it. So
I mean, these are pretty heavy, I can tell, right? So I got a bunch of history books, and my, I don't know, secret fantasy is to take a week off and just immerse myself in that, but I don't know when that's going to happen. Seriously.
One of the other really fundamental books that I thought was this book by Will Durant. It's called Story of Philosophy, and it's just a really well condensed version of different philosophers, their lives, and what did they sort of write about or philosophize about, kind of thing. So I thought it's a very wide ranging kind of book, but it's written by with a lot of knowledge and insight.
Might be a poor comparison, but there's this book called Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss that also, I mean, something that I've been meaning to read, which people say, I mean, that's pretty much what it is, right? It's very distilled wisdom from a bunch of super people. Yeah. So what? Sorry, go ahead. You were saying something?
No, I've heard great things about that book. I still haven't read it though.
Yeah, I mean, same thing. Same. What podcasts do you listen to, and podcasts that you recommend?
Yeah, so I listen to the Economist radio. So it gives me like a wide sort of range of things to chew on, kind of thing.
Right.
I listen to the Shane Parrish podcast.
The Knowledge
it's called
Project.
The Knowledge Project.
That's
yeah,
amazing.
I used to listen to Tim Ferriss quite a bit. I like, the way he presents stuff.
Yeah.
And I like the depth both of these guys explore.
Mm-hmm.
I listen to the podcast from HBR. I listen to also HBR has this amazing podcast called The Idea Cast.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think I focus a lot of my listening these days on leadership and
Nice.
companies, cultures, and those kind of things. I and personal development in that sense. So,
Nice.
which is why Tim Ferriss and those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right, I mean, we're almost at the end of the podcast. I'm sure we could talk for another couple of hours about everything that, we spoke about earlier, right? It's been super fun. So we want to end the podcast with something that you're optimistic about, one thing that you're really, really optimistic about going forward. Could be personal, could be about the world, whatever.
Okay, that's a difficult one because right now we're in this spot,
exactly.
right? Like where things are. I think things will get better as we go along, and I'm optimistic that especially the next generation. I mean, not like we're old, and even our generation can see the difference between the right and wrong, and so there are still people out there who, when they see injustice and things like that, they call it out and this thing, and not just keep quiet about it. So that's very encouraging.
Interesting. All right, man, this was a super fun conversation. Thanks so much for making the time. I know we overshot our time limit by crazy, but this was amazing. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I had fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Startup Operator. We'll interview operators at fast-growing startups and curate insights that can help you do better. This podcast is available on all popular platforms. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe and share. Thank you. Until next time, put your head down and execute.